Well, and I actually have a pretty good example of this in Diablo 4 that I think can illustrate this, which is the world bosses. Like the world bosses, I mean, you essentially like you fight them based upon whoever happens to be around at the time. And so in that sense, like, and as a result, the way in which they're designed is not dependent upon you, because okay, think about a boss in WoW, even a world boss. Like, parties and raids generally have to have pretty specific structures. Like, you need to have people in defined roles, like tank, healer, damage, and so forth, and they have to perform particular functions. And you have to think, as Lauren just said, very deliberately and very carefully about like how you're going to compose that unit in order to fight a boss. And this is the same in other MMOs as well. It's the same in Final Fantasy 14. Whereas with a world boss in Diablo, it's more like, if there are 5 sorcerers in the area, then 5 sorcerers are going to fight the world boss and probably defeat them if like the players are even remotely skilled in any way, shape, or form. But then like then none of that matters. Like, it could have been 5 barbarians, it could have been 5 necromancers, it could have been 5 rogues, it could have been 5 druids, it could have been 2 druids, 3, like, it doesn't matter. And the mere fact that it doesn't matter, and that the encounter and the way in which sort of like it articulates with the characters who happen to be present, it is far more dependent upon the player's ability to execute those twitch mechanics than it is upon sort of like constructing the entire situation. Because if we're trying to think about how like the social situation translated from tabletop RPGs to video games, it was primarily through that sort of like turn-based combat, where like you had to sort of construct an entire system of how you were going to approach an encounter. Whereas with Diablo, it's like, how good mash buttons in the right order. Like, that's I'm sorry, I'm that's a bit too flippant, because I actually do like the Diablo games, and I don't want to be flippant about it. But that is the emphasis. It's not on these other aspects. So even things that might seem similar, like, oh, but like, MMOs have world bosses and Diablo has world bosses, but they actually function totally differently in those two game contexts.
But Nicholas, so we keep talking about how an RPG is its mechanics and its systems and its core game loop. But
Yeah.
like what people play role playing games, isn't it all about the story?
No.
Where for art is the narrative?
Why go to story is go away. That is a good point, because especially in the transition. Okay, not even in the transition. If you go back to sort of like tabletop role playing, like, campaigns they almost always had a narrative focus. Like, the beginning and middle and end, like, this happens and then this happens and then this happens. Like, that is the way in which campaigns, like the long term of gameplay, is structured. And that did get translated directly into video game RPGs. And so that is kind of a core mainstay.
Yeah.
But the thing is, like, what's weird, and so the counter argument to this is that, like, if you look at the ongoing evolution of tabletop role playing games, they have actually in many ways evolved away from this. Both your example earlier of Pathfinder, they're both path games, Pathfinder, and it's sort of more encounter centric design. But even D&D, at least in the context of Adventurers League, has become more encounter centric in that limited context. And so the thing is, like, even sort of classic role-playing games of like the good old-fashioned, like, that your grandpappy used to play, even they are evolving towards a model of gameplay that is actually less narrative centric and more encounter centric.
Right. And this is now defining narrative as if it's a core campaign, right? And
Yeah.
you're going, but Lauren, you said you played Diablo 4. Don't you know that there's like the 5 worlds and then there's like the 5 acts of your campaign?
Yeah.
And there's these cutscenes that you can trigger and they're like really beautiful. There's
Yes,
this
they are.
whole story. And I'm like, okay, everyone, 2 things. Yes. However, right? I think what's really fascinating is that when you look at the evolution of role playing games into a single player experience, like we kind of highlighted a little bit earlier in this episode,
Yeah.
is that there's that emotional connection from portraying or role playing or casting yourself in like as a existing unit of say society,
Yeah.
and then having that reflected back to you on something that we haven't talked about, or we haven't talked about in a while, I should say, is companions.
Yeah.
So the Dragon Age, Knights of the Old Republic, your responses or the way you acted upon the world was reflected as a good or bad based on the companions that were around you.
Yeah.
And that was honestly as a foil to the fact that your actions, say as the rogue in a D&D party, and you're going to
Yeah.
steal everything, your players, like the paladin, would go, could you just stop stealing everything, right? Like there is this
Yeah.
natural multiplayer aesthetic, right?
Yeah.
And you see this playing out in Divinity as well, because you can do stealing and thieving, right? Versus you can play a good character who would not be opposed to that.
Yeah.
Also, or who would be opposed to that, excuse me. And so, like, there's that central social narrative you see in the single player games through NPCs. I'm bringing that up because in Diablo 4, yes, there's a core campaign, and yes, there's a story, and there's beautiful cutscenes. Like, it definitely looks like they're like, we want to have Game Narrative of the Year award,
Yeah.
right?
Lilith did nothing wrong.
Lil-
I'm gonna go.
I love that. But what I'm saying is what's interesting is, yes, Diablo has gotten more story centric, I think, because it does have such rich, interesting lore and interesting narratives to tell within those. But I think for me, where it really falls apart for, like, to me, is that while the central nature of character progression exists for these role playing games,
Yeah.
it doesn't exist in the same way that role playing in its history and its lineage through IRC chats, through MUDs, through actually just talking to people. Like that's where the word role play comes from, is
Yeah.
through talking to people. And then in the real world, you'll also know is like comedy has improv, right? It's
Yeah.
about reacting to others, that human element, or reacting to the systems elements, right, of these role playing and central role playing games. Is that Diablo 4 doesn't really allow me to do that. Who I choose in the world, right, no matter which character, the story never changes. There's
Yeah.
no reaction, there's no reactivity. And that reactivity, right, to the society or this world that I've been placed in, I think is the crux for me that made me go, no, Diablo 4 is not a role playing game. Because it's not so much about the story or the lore, it's about the way the world reacts to my presence in that world
Yeah.
if it becomes, right, a role playing game for me.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point because, like, despite the fact that D4 has really, really rich story and really sort of deep lore now, like after the fact, and in many ways, like 3 and 4 both kind of retconned 1 and 2 to kind of make them seem like they had more lore
They
than they
did
actually did.
do, yeah. But I kind of like that though, because to be fair, like all game franchises do that. And let's move
But the thing is, like, if you think about, again, looking at sort of like how you interact with the narrative from a gameplay perspective, because a lot of players, especially those who are like hardcore Diablo 2 fans, I've noticed that a lot of like streamers in particular, like, we're just skipping all like narrative content in Diablo 4, just like skipping right through it, like cutscene, whatever.
Oh, my partner did the
skip.
exact same thing. He's like, "Oh, I
Percent-
finished the campaign in 10 years, in 10 hours."
yeah,
And the campaign for Diablo 4, by the way, I think is 23 hours or 25
I bet,
hours.
yeah.
And he did it in 10. Like
Yeah,
in a
'cause
night.
Yeah, because they're just skipping. Because the thing is, for people who have that kind of like history with Diablo as a series, for them, what the game is what is actually Brevik's ideal. Is what goes all the way back to this idea that it is a particular style of gameplay. And so then the thing is, in that sense, then the cutscenes and like the voiceover dialogue and all that stuff is getting in the way of what like your lizard brain is telling you a Diablo game is supposed to be. And the thing is, the game allows you to do that. A game like Dragon Age doesn't allow you to do that. You kind of can't not
And
interact with the narrative.
exactly. And
Yeah.
the reason why Dragon Age, but also the BioWare games in general, have included dialogue choice as such a central focus is because they knew that if it was just they gave you a preset character to go through, you would skip the scenes, and interacting and engaging with the societal problems of the Dragon Age universe would no longer be important to you.
Yeah.
And so even if it was, say, they tried to do a multiplayer version of Dragon Age, it would be incredibly difficult to argue with the two sides of what multiplayer gameplay is and the new climate of what is a role-playing game at all, right? In our
Yeah.
industry standards now. Like
Yeah.
that's why dialogue choice is important in a game where role play is, say, like a tenet of that franchise. Versus, yeah, skip the cutscenes in a multiplayer game for all I care. Like it's not about that, right?
Yeah,
I mean, she
exactly.
says as a narrative designer, this is why though I always want a skip cutscene button for games that want to appeal to a variety of people, because I
Yeah.
know that there are some people out there that Like my partner is doing he did his 10-hour playthrough. He's played hundreds of hours of Diablo 4 already,
Yeah.
right? The issue is that now he's replaying it with me and he's like, yeah, now that I'm playing it with you, I'll watch the cutscenes because he
Yeah.
actually really loves story and he really loves narrative. The
Yeah.
issue is that with his friend group, his history of playing Diablo since the first one, right, is all no, I'm going to play with my friends, and my friends are already there because they have no life, and I can't watch these cutscenes.
Well, not only that, but like you mentioned the sort of the classic act structure of Diablo games, which by the way was introduced in 2. So 1 doesn't have that act structure. But the thing is, like the act structure itself was more like they weren't even really acts in the sense of a play or like a play script or a narrative. They were more in the sense of like these are the zones. Like they just called different zones different
Yep.
acts. But when it did have a narrative focus from 3 on, what was weird is that they still then had that Diablo 2 aspect where it's like you play through the story, but then to continue the progression of your character, you play through the story again, but harder, and then you play through it again, but harder. At which
And
point,
you
like,
do the same thing in 4 as well.
yeah,
Yeah.
and so that's still there, and
And so I think it'll be really fascinating once I actually get to World Tier 2 because I'm still on World Tier 1.
yeah,
And I want to actually play. It's very hard for me, but now I have all my friends are playing it. So this has become a lot easier to play Diablo 4 for this reason.
yeah,
Is that once I actually, I think, complete the story of Diablo 4, which I just have not yet, then I'll be able, which now Final Fantasy 16 coming out. I promise I will play Diablo 4, listeners, like all the way through, okay? Before I start Final Fantasy 16, I must.
you got like a
Is
week, so you better get on it.
I know I've got a week. I think that I'll be able to kind of actually do a more deep dive analysis of Diablo 4's narrative act structure plus the story structure because I think it will be very discongruous because right now it is, and I just want to
Yeah,
know, does it feel that way when I play it the second time? If that makes any sense. Like right now I'm already feeling discongruity, but I don't know yet,
yeah,
and that's my outstanding question, right? Ending kind of on this Diablo 4's story and lore history. For me, if that's really important of that mirroring aspect of your place in society versus this,
yeah,
Nicholas is rightfully pointing out that Diablo 4, particularly 3 onward, tried to be more of that social, easy to pick up and counter based game. Very
yeah,
short. You play it for the 20, 30 minutes or a couple hours and you get out, right? That's
yeah,
just like a sports game. I mean, well, that's
yeah.
just like how sports are. A
Yeah,
sports
yeah, the
game.
game ends. There's a clock.
But there's a clock, the game ends, right?
Yeah.
Is they built that into Diablo, right? They built this into the game franchise. So how can you do a story when there is a clock like that? I mean,
Yeah.
it's called movies, Lauren. But like but
Well,
still, right?
it isn't because like there are ways in which you can tell fragmentary narratives, but then that has to be focused on the vignette rather than on sort of like a long narrative plot line. But that's not what Diablo's doing. Diablo's not presenting to you these narrative vignettes that you can kind of consume in, between between a half hour and an hour. Like that's just not how it's structured.
And it's a totally different narrative structure as well if we
Yeah.
were going to do vignette, say, encounter based design, which actually, Nicholas, you brought up with the whole Dungeons and Dragons is moving to that model. And
Yeah.
it's because people have less time now in gaming. They don't have 10 hours to play for a Saturday, right? They have 1 hour, 2 hours, 30 minutes even, right? Battle Royale was huge for that. So kind
Yeah.
of like, yeah, like we're kind of seeing this general, I guess, industry shift moving. But before we super conclude on this whole, and the industry is changing and the world is fantastic and games are expanding, let's end on kind of like, what is the real answer to the question, is Diablo 4 an RPG?
Well, I think we can. Well, I mean, you could look at it two ways. You could call it a hybrid if you want. I mean, because one way to resolve this problem that we've just presented, which is that like there are good yes arguments and there are good no arguments, and it's like, well, okay, it could be a hybrid. It could like involve elements of A, but then also have a lot of elements of B, and they could exist to such quantities that like you can't really put it in one category or another. So instead of thinking of like action RPG as sort of like action is a modifier of RPG, it's more like it is an action game slash RPG. So like that's one way of thinking about it. Or if you want to sort of think about it in more like hoity-toity philosophical terms, you can think of it like in a kind of dialogic or a dialectical way, where like you have this game that seems to embody a particular contradiction. Like but the thing is, the problem is the contradiction and like the sort of the thought processes that go into saying like, oh well, an RPG has to be this, an action game has to be this, whereas you could actually look at a game like Diablo 4 as directly challenging those preconceptions and providing possibly a way forward to sort of think about the further evolution of action adventure games or the further evolution of RPGs. Like Diablo could be sort of like a pivot point, if you will. Or it doesn't have to be like it, but it could be. And I think that's probably a much more sensible way of looking at it rather than this kind of like, no, yes, sort of like this
Yeah.
just like knee jerk reaction.
And I will say that the knee-jerk reactions what spawn like these conversations. Like I think a very healthy creative relationship in games is always about creative tension. You're
Yeah.
supposed to butt heads, but it's because you move forward. And
Yeah.
Diablo 4 was definitely one of those moments for us where we absolutely butted heads with like, yes, Nicholas, no, Lauren. And then honestly, through talking to each other, the more we kept saying no, it wasn't an RPG, the more I actually found myself going, well, actually, maybe
No,
it
actually.
does have a lot of those right role playing
Yeah.
elements to
Yeah.
it that I wasn't quite clicking with right away because of my preconceived notions about what I loved, right? About role
Yeah.
playing games,
Yeah.
which then, right, is different than what other people might love about role playing games, right? So I think it is interesting to consider Diablo 4 a hybrid. It's also interesting to say Diablo 4 is also this pivot point or this kind of like fulcrum of going and conversation and dialogue about what really does appeal to players about role playing games, about these action RPGs.
Yeah.
And the whole ARPG kind of acronym itself feels like a dialectical concern. Like it doesn't
Yeah.
quite hit action because I do think there's some strategy involved in Diablo 4. Like
Yeah.
it's not a Tomb Raider, but it's also incredibly linear despite being very replayable. So it's no
Yeah.
longer really procedural anymore, right? Like the maps kind of don't change in Diablo 4, at least from what I've seen. But once again, right, I haven't replayed it. So for all I know, they do actually shift around.
The dungeons
The
are
dungeons do.
procedurally generated, but the overworld is not. The overworld
But
is
yeah.
fixed.
And so, and that difference between the overworld, right, the dungeons, that you could say correlates directly to, right, a world map in like Baldur's Gate.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, right? So, and then, or here we are in Persona 3, even, right? So, I think that's what's really interesting and why I'm really glad we got to talk about this. And we did creatively butt heads for like a week and a half
Yeah.
because it was really interesting for us to both kind of look at it and go, okay, maybe role playing games are changing, but like, what are they changing into and why?